Hello, hello. Interpretation, we're ready to start, please. Because we have 5 minutes now.
We're waiting for them to distribute these to the audience.
Yeah, but I want to start before as they're doing that because they're mainly English speaking and
Yeah,
this is 5 minutes left already. Yeah. Let's see.
Attention, please. The receiver and headset for translation is here, okay?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. While we're getting set up, and I just wanted to let you know there is another event just right after this one, organized by Rainforest Foundations and the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities on the 1.7 billion pledge, and it will take place at 4:45 at the Hatshepsut room, right? It's not far from here. So we would like to invite everyone who are following this conversation to go there. It's pretty much a similar type of conversation, but at another level. And the organizers are here, so they will be happy to see everyone there. All right, so seems like we're all set, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the panel on territorial financing, empowering communities for climate action. And I'm very privileged to be moderating this panel with my colleagues from all over the world and who are mainly partners and collaborators of the Rights and Resources Initiative. The way we will go about this session, I'll start with just framing the conversation and providing some context. Then after that, I will give the floor to each panelist for 5 minutes to just give us a brief introduction of who they are and the type of work they do around this topic. Just 5 minutes, please. Then after that, I'll be engaging with the panelists, asking them questions. Then after the questions, we'll open it to the floor for additional questions, comments, then we will wrap up. All right, without further ado, just to remind everyone, the purpose of this workshop is to bring attention to the emerging ecosystem of mechanism for channeling funding directly to collective right holders and their supporting organizations to both manage and conserve their lands, territories, and pursue their self-determined climate actions and priorities in alignment with global priorities. And what are we really trying to get out of this conversation? We want to bring awareness, urgency to support broader right holders-led opportunities, comprehensive of dry lands, tropical landscape, and seascapes. All types of ecosystems are equally important as they contribute to biodiversity, conservation, carbon sequestration, and in general to climate change mitigation and adaptation. It is also about indigenous people from all ecosystems, including the pastoralists, those living in dry land and coastal areas, local communities, and Afro-descendant people. So why all of this is very important, I just wanted to mention three additional points here. First, to say that if indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant and women within this group are not meaningfully contribute to achieving the 2030 climate and biodiversity goal, then their rights to land and forests must be recognized, and they must have access to more direct financial resources. There must be more equitable partnerships between the donor community and right holders. The second point is that securing the tenure rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, and women is critical to bridging these gaps and combating the climate and biodiversity crisis. But more coordination is required between those who have historically funded the sector and right holders. And as we all have seen, there are emerging funding mechanisms at the national, regional, and global level. And all of this is very consistent with commitments made under Article 6.8, which is the only article that focuses on cooperation mechanism to address mitigation and adaptation in a holistic manner. And that is fully aligned with the values, mission, and priorities of indigenous peoples and local communities. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to each of the panelists. And I'll start from my right with Grace, to just tell us who she is, which organization she represents, and also why this topic is important. Then we'll move to the left, and after that we can engage in the conversation. Grace, you have the floor. And please put the mic just in front of you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you all here in this side event. In relation to the vision and guiding principles that we have been talking about in relation to direct access of funds, we had been having several global consultations as well as regional consultations among indigenous peoples organizations before COVID. And later we put this forward and revisited it. And as we have agreed, our vision for direct access to funding is really to have a long-term indigenous peoples-led programs that had been developed by indigenous peoples themselves, and in addressing climate change impacts in the context of our own priorities and perspectives, as well as our indigenous people's self-determined development. We have also agreed on some basic principles that we wanted to put on the table in relation to achieving this. And of course, we would like to have holistic approaches in terms of programs that are consistent to our knowledge, to our innovations and governance systems, and to which are culturally appropriate as may be determined by each indigenous peoples. We need support for programs that will really lead to a paradigm shift in our contributions regarding in lowering emissions, as well as strengthening climate resilience initiatives of indigenous peoples and local communities. Secondly, we want to put in place IP policies in all of these funds that are there. We have already done that in the Green Climate Fund as well as in the World Bank funds, but we really needed to see how this is sincerely implemented on the ground and to monitor how this has been implemented with indigenous peoples and local communities. We always operate in a participatory and transparent manner, guided by our own collective decision-making processes, and we want this uh, to be approved by whatever indigenous peoples organizations or communities, and also our customary governance structures that are put in place in the communities. We still get guidance from our traditional knowledge holders, our elders in our communities, who provide us with advice as to what are their priorities and which is appropriate to the communities. Of course, this is a continuous learning process for us, and we draw lessons from whatever experience we have over the years, and build on this and make some improvements or replicate whatever was really implemented on the ground. We should also continue to be gender responsive, as well as to have intergenerational approaches wherein the youth should be also involved and should learn from the elders on how these processes of programs should be implemented on the ground. Lastly, I would just say that the indigenous peoples organizations or the local traditional customary governance structures should be the ones to be direct managers and implementors of this fund, or whatever support is provided for indigenous peoples and local communities. Further, I will just like to mention as well that we have also set priorities on the approaches or the types of programs that we would like to be supported with whatever funds that we are accessing, or whatever funds are there for indigenous peoples and local communities. Of course, our number one consideration is the security to our land tenure, our waters, territories, and resources. We also want to support sustainable use, access, and management of our resources and landscapes, and as well as increasing resilience of diverse ecosystems that we have, leading to continued provision for our ecosystem services. Lastly, we would like to strengthen as well indigenous peoples' governance systems, and also putting in place various platforms for capacity building, including the management of these resources, as well as the continued requirements that we need to do in relation to the management of funds that are directly accessed by our organizations. Having said that, I think I'll end there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grace. Let's listen from Kimaren, then we'll move to Pasang.
Good afternoon. My name is Kimaren Oleriamit. I come from the Maasai community. This is an indigenous pastoralist community based in Kenya, southern Kenya to be precise. And I am interested in this discussion because there is an apparent inequality, a glaring inequality in the way the landscapes are appreciated, the way the landscapes, the diverse ecosystems are supported. And the pastoral landscape is one of the landscapes that I think has not received the attention that it should achieve, or even the appreciation of the contribution that it brings to ecosystem services, biodiversity conservation, climate change resilience, and the knowledge associated to it. So really, I look forward to a robust discussion on this issue, and it's a very timely discussion. Thank you.
Namaskar, Tasdile. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pasang Dolma Sherpa. I work for Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development. I'm from Sherpa Indigenous community from the Himalaya in Nepal. This discussion has really inspired me to be part of the panel, and my great pleasure to be here with my Indigenous brothers and sisters. You know, like we have been always prioritizing, focusing on that how the important role and contribution Indigenous peoples and local communities, women, youth have been playing on the ground, especially for sustaining the ecosystem, you know, the landscape and the biodiversity, and that has been the really basis for the climate change resilience. But the problem what we have, the existing climate architect and the mechanism, the flow of finance, is either goes to the government or bigger NGO, even at the national level. And the contributor, the role and contribution that who did it, where it goes only hardly the drops. So I'm here to discuss how important role played by Indigenous peoples and local communities and the women and the youth on the ground. And this is not justice if we just continue the same wheel again, no? So we really are here to discuss that the recognition of our land tenure security, the recognition of our customer institution, recognition of our self-governance system, recognition of our way of life and traditional values and spiritual, cultural norms, that has been really symbiotic relation with the natural resources, ecosystem, and biodiversity. Only with the recognition, with the legal recognition of the customer institution, only it is possible to survive this knowledge and values, and that has been the basis for climate change resilience and addressing the whole global climate crisis. Thank you.
So hi everyone, my name is Esther and I'm a technical advisor at Blue Ventures. So Blue Ventures is an NGO, and we've been working with coastal communities to restore their fisheries and ensure that they are more sustainable. So Blue Ventures is going to launch a fund early 2023 that we are calling the Frontline Climate Fund, which is a new initiative. And this initiative aims to drive a multi-year flexible funding to community-based organizations along the coast in the tropics. So Blue Ventures has spent over 2 decades supporting coastal communities to rebuild their fisheries and to restore ocean life, and also to protect their blue carbon ecosystems, such as mangroves. These coastal communities are faced with unprecedented and escalating challenges, from overfishing to pollution to the climate emergency, which are threatening their fish stocks. And sometimes these communities also end up degrading their mangrove forests in order to be able to feed their families, and yet mangroves underpin livelihoods for millions of coastal people. So this then escalates the challenge about fish stocks, the depleted fish stocks. So these coastal communities contribute the least to the climate emergency, but then they're the worst affected by it because they're some of the poorest and most marginalized communities in the planet. But then because of their local knowledge and their lived experience, they're also best placed to actually take care and conserve and restore these ecosystems. So what Blue Ventures has realized is that these communities, the community-based organizations, need modest and flexible and longer-term funding for them to be able to start and also to scale and sustain these locally led conservation efforts. Donors increasingly want to fund this, but then due to the small size or low capacity or lack of visibility of these community-based organizations, then it makes it challenging, and also the transaction costs associated with that. So in the end, only a fraction of this available finance is reaching these communities, and then very little trickles down and can actually be readily used. So the Frontline Climate Fund aims to address this by providing flexible, no strings attached, and longer-term funding to these community-based organizations that are in the front line of fighting the climate emergency. And then these communities will then use this funding to restore marine life and to safeguard livelihoods and tackle the climate breakdown. Yeah? Okay.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Es para mí un privilegio compartir este panel con mis amigos que están aquí en esta mesa, amigos y amigas. Mi nombre es Gustavo Sánchez, de México. Soy representante de una red de organizaciones comunitarias forestales y también formo parte de la Junta Directiva de la Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosques. Es una plataforma de coordinación entre organizaciones indígenas y de comunidades locales en esta región comprendida entre México y Panamá. Tengo la oportunidad en la Alianza Mesoamericana de liderar una iniciativa de financiamiento territorial que se llama Fondo Territorial Mesoamericano. Como ustedes saben, hay estudios que demuestran que solo el 1% de la inversión climática de la última década ha llegado directamente a los territorios. El resto se ha quedado en otros actores, se ha dispersado en la intermediación y nosotros tenemos un diagnóstico donde creemos que una de las causas es el diseño del sistema de financiamiento climático. Este no fue diseñado pensando en que las comunidades y sus organizaciones accedieran directamente al financiamiento, sino a través de gobiernos, de grandes ONGs, de otro tipo de actores. Entonces, con el Fondo Territorial Mesoamericano estamos creando un mecanismo que facilite el acceso directo de los territorios a los recursos y tenemos una visión donde consideramos que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades territoriales están ya haciendo una inversión climática fuerte, de saberes, de trabajo, de manejo del territorio, y que tenemos que abandonar la visión de ver donantes y beneficiarios. Las comunidades estamos haciendo ya una inversión y quisiéramos hacer un llamado a vernos en igualdad de circunstancias, a vernos de igual a igual y hacemos un llamado a una asociación de coinversión. Es importante que se reconozca el aporte que están haciendo las comunidades y que si se cuantificara, probablemente sería de igual o mayor valor de las inversiones que están haciendo monetariamente gobiernos, fundaciones y otros actores. Este Fondo Territorial Mesoamericano estamos realizando el segundo pilotaje y esperamos que antes de terminar el año o a principios del siguiente, en el mes de enero, podamos tener el tercer ejercicio piloto que nos permita tener una serie de aprendizajes para escalar esta manera de financiamiento de manera que genere impactos significativos. Buscamos con esto inspirar a los gobiernos a hacer una inversión sustantiva en los territorios. Creemos que este tipo de mecanismos no sustituye ni debe sustituir el papel de la inversión gubernamental y que todos los países, tanto los desarrollados como los que están en vías de desarrollo, tienen que hacer el esfuerzo de invertir en los territorios. Pero para eso se requieren una serie de condiciones que superar y de inercias que abandonar. En la siguiente parte del panel estaré comentando más al respecto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, everyone, for these insightful introductions. And definitely what we have been hearing is the need for a paradigm shift and system change, but also how to keep in mind and also recognize the indigenous peoples and local communities' own perspective, the intergenerational approaches, but also we've heard about the need to diversify the landscapes. Tropical forested countries, but also drylands, coastal areas, all of that contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. But also we've heard funding mechanisms such as the Frontline Climate Fund, the Mesoamerica Fund, and all the funding mechanisms actually that have been developed and led by indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think we are really within a context, a very interesting context in terms of really making sure that the right holders are the one driving really the decision-making processes, but also getting having direct access to funding. I'll start the series of questions, and I'll start with Grace. And Grace, I mean, you've talked a lot about the importance of indigenous people's knowledge, the work they do, and the importance of having direct access to funding. So my question to you is, what does direct access to climate financing mean for indigenous peoples? And the other related one is, what is the vision you are pursuing, and what are the key principles you want to see enacted? And you have 5 minutes, please, 5 minutes, okay? Thank you.
Okay. Actually, I already mentioned about all of that, but except that I would like to define direct access according to indigenous peoples' definitions, as we have also agreed in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus here. We know that for so many years, most of the funds coming to indigenous peoples' lands or communities are channeled through international NGOs to the government or to other NGOs that are either nationally based. And we really haven't experienced, or we have experienced some of these funds from philanthropic organizations that are directly going to indigenous peoples' organizations. However, these big funds which are committed, like for the 1.7 billion pledge by the state parties and private corporations in the COP26, we haven't yet got any cent of that until now. And that's where we say that we really need direct access, wherein this should be channeled through indigenous peoples' organizations, either at the regional or national and subnational levels. But we need to have a system of capacities, or a level of capacity in really managing this. And we also had, we already had experiences on how indigenous peoples have successfully managed funds that were raised or that were provided. And we can prove, or we have a track record of directly managing and reaching out until the communities for these funds to directly support our communities and indigenous peoples' organizations on the ground. Yeah, of course, we wanted also a programmatic approach into these funds, wherein it's not just a very small grant to support one activity, but it should be programmatic in terms of how indigenous people see their holistic sustainable development. And it should support the process of undergoing a free, prior, and informed consent process. And then wherein those who have agreed to design this project should be the main actors, or should be the ones to define what they need or their priorities in this programmatic approach of implementation of this. and they should be considered as partners in the process and not only treated as beneficiaries. They should be there should be a participatory process from the design to the implementation plan until the monitoring and evaluation processes. I think I'll end there, Solange. And
Thank you
others.
very much, Grace. I think, yeah, three important questions. It's good to see that indigenous peoples have defined really what they mean by direct access. And as you rightly said, making sure that the funding goes directly to the national and regional indigenous network. And I think we always talk a lot about direct access without really thinking about the FPIC as a very important process to go through. And I think we all should be reminded about that. And of course, indigenous as partners and not beneficiaries. And I'll turn to Esther and Kimaren, and I think in this conversation you're bringing two new dimensions. One is the pastoralist as indigenous communities, but also the coastal landscape that we generally don't talk about. So to me, the question is really, why is it important to ensure that mechanisms and funds are channeled to other landscape, like the pastoralist landscape and also the coastal and mangrove landscape? What are the specific challenges and opportunities? Let's start with Esther, then after we can move to Kimaren.
Okay, so I think, I could hear myself. Oh. Okay, so I think one key thing is that we mostly talk about agriculture, and when we talk about food and communities, we think mostly about terrestrial communities and maybe agriculture and such. But then we rarely talk about fisheries, and it's a very large sector. Actually, from the latest report by the Food and Agriculture Organization, so the FAO, small-scale fishers are close to 500 million. Small-scale fisheries support at least 492 million people, so they underpin the livelihoods of so many people. So there's a need to actually fund these communities and to include them in conversations. And we've also realized as Blue Ventures over our 2 decades of work that conservation works best when it's put in the hands of those that are most affected by it. And so if we put conservation in the hands of coastal communities and give them a leading role and actually provide them with this funding, then conservation mechanisms are bound to work. So what the Frontline Climate Fund would be doing is it would also be providing funders with an opportunity to actually fund these high impact projects, and funders will not be missing out on this just because of maybe the efficiency or the scale or the visibility of these coastal communities. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Esther. I think when you talked about the need to put conservation in the hands of coastal communities, I will just say it's the same for all the other landscape too, and all the indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant, because I think they could be the one to contribute a lot into biodiversity conservation and really meeting all the climate crisis. Thank you for that reminder. And Kimaren?
Yeah, thank you again, and it's great listening my colleagues here on this table. I'm learning a lot. And it's very refreshing that we are seated here to think about all landscapes. Why? First, because ecosystems and landscapes are interdependent. And it's actually the connectivity of these landscapes and ecosystems that provides opportunity for resilience, but not the fragmentation that we often imagine. Each of these landscapes represent its own unique contribution to ecosystem services. And basically, it's part of the whole. The story of conservation, the story of biodiversity, conservation, resilience, climate resilience is incomplete if we do not account for the entire landscapes as we know them. Each landscape actually represents a unique body of knowledge systems, a knowledge of place that is unique to this landscape, knowledge of which, if it is not accounted for in our financing, in our support systems, the world will certainly lose a lot of this valuable knowledge that supports conservation. Each landscape actually represent unique vulnerabilities. And because vulnerabilities are different, it means strategies also will be landscape and ecosystem specific to respond to these vulnerabilities. And the reality of the matter is some of these critical landscapes, critical in both scale and critical in both the value of contribution to ecosystem services, have been neglected for a while. And one of these landscapes that I think has been forgotten or pushed to the periphery is a pastoral landscape, the dry lands, savannas, grasslands, for example, of East Africa. And this is a very large landscapes. In Africa, it represents 43% of the land surface of Africa is pastoral savanna rangelands. They represent, studies have shown that grasslands host 34% of carbon, but rarely is this ecosystem services mentioned. The link between pastoralism and conservation is a very interesting link because we often conveniently generate narratives that speak of conservation in pastoral landscape and are silent on the pastoralists that have contributed to landscapes that are healthy to sustain these conservation initiatives. The case of Kenya, for example, 92% of the protected area is in dry land and pastoral lands. How is it that these landscapes are excellent spaces for wildlife conservation, flora and fauna, but they are not good enough to attract support for pastoralism who have made use of this difficult ecosystem? These landscapes, for example, in Africa host a quarter of the continental population. A quarter of African population is actually dependent and being fed and sustained by these landscapes. And so basically what we have seen is that we have seen a very encouraging targeting of forests, which we appreciate because they are landscapes of indigenous peoples and is highly welcome. Now imagine the 1% that my brother Gustavo talked about, 1% reaching to indigenous people territories. How much is reaching these pastoral landscapes that are forgotten? We need to ask. And basically it's refreshing to hear my sister Esther there talking about mangroves and coastal because it's also one of the landscapes that hasn't seen the support that it needs to be. In fact, I think the leakage that we experience in carbon emission reduction is not going to be in the tropical forest because we are focusing on them. If we do not have a full picture of the ecosystem, the emission reduction we think we are gaining in tropical forest is actually going to be lost in dryland forests because we are neglecting them and we are not focusing on them. So if we want to succeed in biodiversity conservation, in climate resilience and adaptation strategy, we need to have a full picture of the ecosystem and account in terms of support for resources and uptake of the knowledge associated with these landscapes. And I thank you for listening to me.
Well, great statistics that I think most of us don't have. So it really shows the need to really link dryland, savanna, pastoralism, and conservation and how they are contributing to carbon sequestration, but also that the majority of lands in Africa actually are in dryland. Another important, I think, point that you raised, Kimaren, is that interconnectivity of the landscapes that you talk about, and I think we all should be reminded of that and also have a full picture of all ecosystem as we're talking about funding reaching directly to indigenous peoples and local communities. I'll turn into Pasang. So Pasang, as an indigenous leader and also a member of the steering committee of Clarify, can you tell us about the challenges actually that need to be addressed, and what are you trying to do to ensure right holder organizations are able to access climate financing?
Thank you, Solange. I just would like to echo earlier our brothers and sisters what they mentioned on the holistic approach, and that part as a approach and interconnectedness with all the knowledge and values. I just would like to continue on that part. And one of the challenges for indigenous peoples is in the absence of the direct access of the funding, no doubt. But the direct access of the funding is, there are a lot of hurdles, for indigenous peoples and the local communities on the ground. The existing funding mechanism based on our climate finance assessment shows the complicated procedures and also the layers of the transaction of these different the amount, that has been one of the challenges of going down the allocated amount on the ground. Just to share you some examples that the climate finance architect in the context of Nepal also it goes to 20% in the Ministry of Finance, and then before it goes to the Forest Development Carbon Funds, again that 80% is turned into 100%, and then out of 100% again it goes to the federal government and 20% is deducted, and again it goes to the community level, and then another 20% is deducted from the local government, and then just you can imagine the illusion, no? And this illusion we hardly see it from outside, because the illusion is been shown that indigenous people, local community get 80% of the climate finance. But when we really see the statistical data of how the flow is being channelized, is you hardly the drops out of the total. So this illusion need to be is a big challenges for indigenous peoples and local communities in the context of the climate finance, not only in Nepal but any part of the world, because illusion is being shown as if we have a whole budget goes to the ground, and it is, if you see really closely, it is completely an illusion, and then another part is also this. The awareness level and the capacity of the indigenous people, particularly on the ground, is so low, no? And we talk about meaningful participation, and really, we talk about the full and participations and meaningful engagement, and also effective engagement. But in the absence of the flow of the information, how could it be possible? No, this is a really one of the challenges, and then what, as a steering committee member of the Clarify, we really want to dig it out, no, so that all these hurdles in the middle can be filled up, so that we can have a direct access of the funding, and especially indigenous people who have been really contributing for sustaining the ecosystem and biodiversity and natural resource governance, and through their customary governance system and institution, how we can recognize. And if we recognize our, the customary institution, our customary land tenure security, and that is the only basis for, the self-determined sustainable development approach that can be applied, and we can work on the issues and concerns that we can, face, and then address the challenges for continuation of our values and approach for sustainability and continuation by next generation.
Thank you very much, Pasang, for raising most of the challenges that indigenous peoples and local communities have to access to funding, like the procedures, the requirement, all of that. But I think you've raised also an important aspect, which is funding that goes to government and where indigenous people actually have a share, but generally they don't receive that share because the funding goes to the government and they decide how to use it. We have been talking a lot about funding going directly to the indigenous people and local communities, but how about the one that goes to government where they have to engage with indigenous people? And I think the case of Nepal is one, and I'm sure if we look into other countries, we might find the same challenges that we're facing in Nepal. And I'll turn to Gustavo. And Gustavo, I mean, you're a member of AMPB, you're part of the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, and also you are a member of the steering committee of Clarify. So in your experience, what ought to be the defining elements of fit-for-purpose financing for Indigenous peoples and local communities, and what changes do right holders want to see?
Bueno, a mí me parece que un elemento fundamental para superar las barreras que tiene el financiamiento directo a comunidades territoriales es que necesitamos construir un diálogo de confianza. En este momento, tanto la Alianza Global de la que somos parte, la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales, estamos participando en un diálogo con los diferentes actores que hicieron la promesa de Glasgow. Lo importante de este diálogo no es cómo se distribuye el dinero, lo importante es que se reconozca a las organizaciones y sus mecanismos de financiamiento como un camino viable para el financiamiento directo. Tenemos que entender que muchos donantes o financiadores no están convencidos de que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales tengan capacidades para administrar, para ejecutar proyectos con eficiencia y para rendir cuentas de manera transparente. Y es natural que tengan estas dudas porque se ha construido un sistema de financiamiento que está pensado en que sean los gobiernos quienes administren o las grandes ONGs. Nosotros, las organizaciones de pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales, tenemos que convencer a estos actores, a estos coinversores, porque no queremos verlos como donantes, a estos aliados, a que han construido una tramitología muy pesada, donde a veces es más importante el reporte o el informe o la factura que el resultado en el terreno. Y se vuelve una paradoja de que puedes tener buenos informes, pero no tienes un impacto significativo en los resultados que formalmente estás buscando. Entonces, hay diferentes formas de rendir reportes, de demostrar resultados y de ser transparente. Creo que en este diálogo necesitamos movernos de donde estamos cada uno de los participantes en este diálogo y llegar a un punto medio, llegar a un punto donde los reportes, la información sea transparente, pero que no salga más caro reportar que lo que se invierte en los terrenos o en los territorios. Entonces, para nosotros es muy importante una serie de acciones o de características de un nuevo modelo de financiamiento climático. Por ejemplo, una fundamental es que las prioridades deben de ser decididas de manera colectiva por las comunidades en los territorios. No queremos decisiones bien intencionadas, pero que desde alguna oficina se decide cuáles son las prioridades que tiene una comunidad o que se tiene en un territorio. Les vamos a distribuir a la salida de esta sala un folleto del Fondo Territorial Mesoamericano, donde estamos haciendo un primer ejercicio de rendición de cuentas, de rendición de resultados, de los pilotajes que estamos realizando y, bueno, esperamos contribuir con ello a crear esta cultura y convencer a nuestros aliados en estas inversiones a que los mecanismos territoriales construidos tanto por pueblos indígenas como por comunidades locales es una alternativa para que lleguen más recursos a los territorios y a que detengamos a tiempo el cambio climático, a que tengamos una escala suficiente de acciones, a que conservemos la biodiversidad y a que revirtamos la degradación de la naturaleza. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. And I think as part of the list of challenges, you've added another one, which is the bureaucratic aspect of really funding and the reporting versus the result on the ground. But as we know, we all have to comply. But how do we make it flexible? I think that's the question. But also another important point is the need to build a dialogue of trust. And I think that trust is really important. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to give the funding, direct funding to indigenous peoples and local communities and expect them to really meet all the requirements and do it the way like Western NGOs would do. That would be just like, impossible. But I think building the trust is really key. And before giving the floor for comments and questions, I just have one more question for Kimaren, because I know Kimaren, Pasang, and Grace are very involved in like the GCF processes, also engaging with national designated authorities. Grace talked about the need to have FPIC, but I think what I've been also hearing is issues related to do no harm and do good. And Kimaren, I wanted to know, just from your experience being part of all these global processes, what is the experience of indigenous peoples in advocating for policies and safeguards to ensure that climate funds do no harm but do good?
Thank you very much, Solange. And I have been privileged to be in this space of pushing for the recognition and respect of indigenous people's rights for a few years now. And where we are now, the problem is not recognition. The problem is, what does that recognition means? When you look at the multilateral financing entities like the World Bank, they have an indigenous people policy, they have an indigenous people advisory group. When you look at IFAD, the same. When you look at Green Climate Fund, the same. It has a very robust indigenous people policy that speaks about traditional knowledge, recognition of customary tenure, free plan informed consent, including the operational guidelines to enable application of this policy. It has an advisory group to the Green Climate Fund. But the question is, what has been the impact of these policies? The indigenous people did not just push for ink on paper to be recognized in policy documents without a requisite support to enable the realization of these rights on the ground. They did not just push for a voice to come to halls to talk, but they pushed for a robust interaction between these funding agencies and indigenous people that have a bearing on transforming and correcting the way they have been engaged, fast-tracking access to resources. So when you look at, for example, the advisory group, for now, beyond just, being in Songdo to talk about what is happening in the boardroom and the policies and projects, there is no resources as yet to give the IPAG the wherewithal to connect with the indigenous people movement of the world, to bring the experiences with the projects, to bring the perspective of indigenous knowledge to bear to the decision of the Green Climate Fund Board. So I would say that beyond FPIC guidelines, beyond representation in decision-making arrangements, we need to enable the translation of this engagement to recognition of right, support of livelihoods, direct access to resources, because on the ground is where the rubber meets the road. We need to walk the full length so that indigenous people's rights are fully recognized and fully respected. We appreciate the opportunity to have speaking spaces, but we need to go beyond speaking and go to action. Thank you.
Well, this is really the main message, right, of this COP, implementation as a key aspect. And I think going beyond policies, beyond inclusion into decision-making processes, and really making sure that the funds go directly to supporting local livelihoods and all the challenges on the ground are really key. This conversation has been very rich, but I would like to see if there are questions from the audience or comments and to the panelists. I'll be happy to take that, and we can be happy to reply. If not, we can keep on having a conversation with the panelists. But I see one hand over there. Do we have a mic? If not, it would be good if you can just come to the podium. Not sure if we have a mic. Do we have a mic, please? Okay, sorry, can you please come to the podium and just use the mic over there? Sorry about that. It's for translation. Or you can. Yes, you can. I mean, it's here.
Buenas, voy a hablar en español por solidaridad con Gustavo. Quería agradeceros a todos los panelistas porque me ha parecido muy interesante todo lo que habéis compartido y estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que habéis dicho todas, que es muy necesario erradicar la idea de que las personas que viven situaciones de vulnerabilidad, tanto climática como social, no saben administrar su dinero, no saben administrar sus prioridades y no saben qué hacer con su vida. Vengo de AT de Cuarto Mundo, HT Fourth World in English, y estamos hartas de que las personas que viven en extrema pobreza no puedan acceder a dinero, no puedan acceder a fondos porque se asume que no van a saber administrarlos. Quería preguntaros, sobre todo Esther y Gustavo, que habéis hablado de estos fondos que llegan a las comunidades directamente, tenía una pregunta muy logística: ¿cómo llega a las personas directamente? ¿Llega como una especie de ayuda mensual? ¿Llega directamente a los líderes de la comunidad? ¿Llega directamente a los individuos? ¿Cómo llega ese dinero a las comunidades y cómo se administra de forma más práctica? Muchísimas gracias, de verdad.
Thank you. We'll take one more question. And okay, the mic is here.
Thank you, distinguished panelists. And yeah, the voices from our regional, they are really strong. And my concern about the funding mechanism is I think we being the local leaders, you all being local leaders, influencer, and who's been working in this field for decades, more than decades, I think the funding mechanism has to be it has to have a very layers of discussion within the communities, because it should come from the local communities who are in need, not just from the top-down method, but they should also realize what are their needs, not just we as people who are just donating, but just it has to be we need lots of homework. And also the women perspective. We really, because women are the one who take care of, they have the vital role in the community. So there was a research in Nepal that, I'm from Nepal, Vidya, and I'm involved in CIPRED for a lot of women projects. And there has been research, and we found out that in Nepal, there was this microfinancing, and so there was a research, and they were really, they found out that none of the women were they were regularly paying their interest, and nobody was in a bad debt. So you can imagine how responsible they are, how impactful they are in the society. So we should learn from them, and we should really put women in front when gender, especially to overview the funding mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the two questions, and I think you're bringing really the link to poverty and also within community, the most in need, because not all communities are the same. And the gender dimension, because also one of the challenges that we're seeing and we have been hearing from the women who have been having this call to action is how do we make sure that funding goes directly to supporting women's organizations on the ground. So I'll be very happy to hear your thought. Let's start with Gustavo, then we can hear from the other panelists.
Bueno, le agradezco mucho a Virginia y a la compañera de Nepal por sus preguntas. En el caso del Fondo Territorial Mesoamericano, en los pilotos que se han realizado, estamos por el segundo piloto en este momento y son asignaciones que se hacen directamente a las organizaciones que van a las organizaciones territoriales. Puede ser que en algunos casos algún grupo no tenga algún sistema administrativo y en ese caso se le apoya para, digamos, hacer compras, pero que ellos tomen las decisiones respecto a lo que, digamos, en lo que se va a invertir. Y creo que sí es un estereotipo de que las poblaciones en situación de vulnerabilidad no tienen capacidades administrativas. Hace poco hicimos un intercambio en México de mecanismos de financiamiento territorial y uno de los casos que se presentaron fue precisamente un grupo de ahorro y crédito donde las mujeres en situación de pobreza son las que más ahorran, las que mejor administran y que incluso este ahorro puede ser una fuente de financiamiento para otros proyectos. No necesariamente el financiamiento tiene que venir de fundaciones o de gobiernos o de la filantropía, y me parece que esta manera de utilizar el ahorro diversifica las fuentes de financiamiento. A veces solo estamos pensando en donaciones, pero hay otras formas de financiar, incluyendo el tema de las remesas, que en algunos países es la inversión extranjera más importante, como en el caso de México. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Esther, want to comment?
Yes, I think I'd like to comment. So what Gustavo talked about earlier was a very good example or a case of successful funding to indigenous people. So for the Frontline Climate Fund, what we'd be aiming at is, because when funders want to fund these coastal communities, one of the challenges that we noted is that there's like maybe the reporting mechanisms are not in place or such. So what the Frontline Climate Fund would aim to be doing is consistent monitoring and evaluation across the different communities so that you can report to the funders, but in a participatory manner. So both the communities get have the data in their hands, and the data is able to inform their conservation efforts. So they're able to see how far have we gone and what can we do better and all that. So aiming for exchanges like the one Gustavo mentioned. But what she noted was that it's good when the needs come from the communities, so not a top-down approach, so where the communities themselves express the need and even go ahead and maybe form a community-based organization that then receives the funding and is able to have governance over that funding. So they're able to decide what they want to put this funding into. So that's what we aim to do with the Frontline Climate Fund. And then she also mentioned the aspect of gender. So conservation works best where the ones who are actually doing the conservation efforts are able to define the rules. That's when they're able to actually follow those rules that they've defined themselves. And with small-scale fishers, I mentioned that with the latest data that we have, there are about 492 million small-scale fishers. Women actually form half of this. So if women are not involved in these discussions and in defining these rules, then there would be a very great challenge. So we need to focus on gender as well and inclusion of women in these decisions.
Yeah, thanks. I just would like to highlight two things. The one that is a pending things that I was thinking to add and then I missed out. So one of the issues for this funding mechanism, the existing funding mechanism, any part of the world, is especially that mechanism going through the government has really critical issues because that goes through always the legal bodies, legal institution. And for indigenous people, it's a big challenges for that one because indigenous people's customary institution is not legally recognized aid, So how could the beneficiary from this climate finance goes to the indigenous community? It's a big question mark. It's a very clear, because always it goes through the, including even GCF. Now GCF funding all goes through the government treasury, and they always exist, looking for the legal bodies. So that is, in a way, this architect is already like sidelining the indigenous people as a benefit sharing, sharing institution, or benefiting from this climate finance. And that is why, I'm really hopeful from this clarify would really recognize indigenous people, customary land tenure security, customary institution. I'm really passionately involved because, this will bring the recognition so that, there will be a legally recognized body so that they can be benefit from this all financial mechanism. That is part one. And then another part on, I'll just share you my own experience in the GCF. GCF is like in Nepali we call hauguzi. Hauguzi is like, oh, you have a lot of very sweet things, but nothing. That is the experience I have in GCF. I'm sorry, my brother, who've been really rigorously following here for the GCF, but this is my real experience. My daughters, I have twins daughters. They were just 11 months. First time we went to take a training, trying to understand GCF in Bangkok. And it was conducted by UNDP with our partnership from Tebtebba. And that was a kind of inspiration, like, okay, we could do, wow, this is going to do for the really paradigm shift and indigenous people will be benefited. That kind of lot of expectation there. And I'm the person, if I involve, I really involve. I give my heart and mind and body all and put my full, efforts, And I did it. I almost spent for 3 years. But where are we? No, nowhere, Because our concept note for the indigenous people for the first time trying to make it model for the whole world. And then it is become the priority concept note within the, NDS pipeline. But my daughter is now 7 years. And when we developed, when they were just 11 months, and just imagine now that concept note is stocked in the pipeline. And even the amount that has been come with the two projects, with the FAO and Ayushian, what happened? All the money going through the treasury. And all this safeguard, forget about the safeguards. Safeguards is all illusionary, just putting into one corner. And when I did a climate finance assessment, I was just inquiring, what happened to the safeguards? What happened to IP policy, gender policy, environmental social policy? Oh, we have there, how you have been monitoring? Very little influence. My dear friends here, this is really illusional, all illusion. So we need to break this illusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pasang. Yes, this illusion must be broken. But another illusion is, if I may borrow from her wisdom, is that indigenous peoples are the only actors who are condemned to a permanent state of incapacities. They never outgrow small grants. They never learn how to manage. And they have always to be babysitted with small grants so that they can manage resources. We don't give them resources and then we turn around to say they don't have capacities. This is another illusion that must end. And also, just to say that from our sister from Nepal, the foundation for for accessing resources, for needs identification, should be self-determination. The wearer of the shoe know where it hurts. And hence, we need to give indigenous people spaces to self-determine what are their priority needs, what works for them. They are in this landscape, they experience it, they observe it, they know it, they understand it. When we choose to partner with them, self-determination should be the principle of engagement. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that, thanks for your questions. Definitely in the development of programs or projects for indigenous peoples, these are collectively done. It's a basic principle for indigenous peoples to have collective discussions and agree on their priorities. At the same time, in response also to the next question on gender, on giving priority to this, we have an Asia Indigenous Women's Network, and we really have dedicated funds for indigenous women and youth. And along the process, we learned that, and in relation also to other funds, we learned that capacity building is really very important aspect of the whole process, and it should be also included in support, in fund support, as well as in strengthening the capacities of our indigenous peoples organizations, including the women and the youth. And we have been conducting capacity building processes on from developing projects to financial management to organizational management, so that we build capacities of indigenous peoples, women, and youth. And as well as we also build capacities for their engagement and advocacy work with local authorities, as well as national governments. And in the process, as well as in the global processes. And for now, we have many young people and many indigenous women who are now speaking up for and voicing the priorities of indigenous peoples in these processes from local level to national to the global level, because of all of this capacity building that we have been doing over the years. I just like to add that as my contribution. Thank you very much, Solange.
Thank you all. Additional questions, and sir? And there are three. Okay, so we'll take 3 questions, and we'll try to wrap up after that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the presenters. I'm Daniel Kobe from Kenya, from an indigenous community called Ogiek. And I'm very happy with the presentation, because you have tried to tackle the issues which are affecting indigenous peoples. But as mentioned, the word illusion, I'll really wish to say, we are making another wish list for indigenous peoples? Because this wish list is what we have been hearing, and they look so nice in such events. But when it goes to the ground, you are asked for audited accounts, you are asked for specific documentation to be able to prove you are an indigenous community or indigenous organization. And in reality, we need clear self-determination so that we can decide and prioritize on the issues which affect us most. Let me zero in on issues of pastoralism, where my brother Cameron is from. I think the drought affecting the pastoralist is so key and very clear that a specific fund should be tailored to help such indigenous peoples, because their issues are very clear. And when you tell them to really make it clear how they will use the money, sometimes I will always prefer a restricted way of funding to help indigenous people perform well. But if you tell them, I want you to create a specific parameters, that I want you from here to here, not going beyond that. And yet the issues keep changing. They are not stagnant. They keep changing, but now you have been told not to change. So I will really wish you comment, and as you fund are being created for indigenous people, it should be made in such a way that it is not restricted. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Laura. I came from the World Rural Forum. It's a network of farmers organizations and small-scale farmers, and we are seeing this process that the indigenous people is doing with a lot of attention also, because small-scale farmers should also be engaged, no? More engaged in these processes. My question is regarding, you explained very well the need to be accountable, no, and to be trust as administration of the resources, but also what about the results? How do you plan, or how you are already showing the impact? Because I think this is the apart from being part or receiving the funds, it is important in order to scale up, no, to scale up. To show the result that the work invest in the indigenous people is something very worth, no? That can be scaled up. Thank you.
Any last?
Buenas tardes, voy a hacer la pregunta en castellano. Arlen Mariño, del Instituto del Bien Común en Perú. Y mi pregunta era un poco con respecto a cuál consideran ustedes que debería ser el rol de las organizaciones de sociedad civil justamente en estos mecanismos de financiamiento para apoyar adecuadamente a las organizaciones indígenas.
Thank you all for the last 3 questions. I'll give the floor to the panelists. They have each, I would just say 1 minute, because we have 10 minutes to finish this panel. So 1 minute or 2 minutes each maximum to just answer some of these questions. Let's start with Gustavo, then we'll move.
Bueno, yo quisiera comentar que efectivamente todos estos mecanismos de reporte, creo que deberíamos de hacer una propuesta a los diferentes mecanismos de financiamiento sobre cómo rendir estos informes de impacto y de transparencia. Estamos empeñados en eso en el Fondo Territorial Mesoamericano. Como les señalaba, vamos a distribuir un folleto para un poco compartir esta experiencia. Y respecto a lo que decía Arlen, yo creo que el rol de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil puede ser de acompañamiento, de ser aliados. Creo que el reto también es construir un nuevo ecosistema de financiamiento donde todos quepamos, pero que cada quien tenga claro cuál es su rol, y creo que las organizaciones de la sociedad civil pueden ser fundamentales en acompañar las organizaciones indígenas y de comunidades locales. Gracias.
I think I'd first like to respond to his question about it being a wish list. So for us as the Frontline Climate Fund, I think it's one of the ways in which we are actually taking action. So moving away from it being a wish list, but actually taking action. So we are looking to at least fund at least 5 million small-scale fishers by 2030. So it will no longer be a wish list, but we'll take action. And for this funding, it will be multi-year, so longer-term funding, and it would be flexible in that they are able to take a leading role in actually making the rules, and not just a top-down approach of telling them how you want this money to be managed. And then it would be no strings, like what you mentioned about communities actually having to really prove a lot for them to actually get this funding. And then I think one of the roles of civil society would be capacity building. So where these coastal communities are receiving this funding, then you'd provide capacity building in terms of monitoring, in terms of data, and also governance support, just providing the support, and then the communities actually take the leading role. And then also, I think, financial capacity building. And then where funders feel maybe more comfortable to provide funding to the larger NGOs, then this should actually now trickle down to the indigenous people and the communities themselves. So I think that could be a role, because these civil societies or maybe even larger NGOs probably have those reporting mechanisms, and some funders actually maybe trust that kind of mechanism. Then you could have that advantage of receiving funds from maybe larger funders, and then make this trickle down to the coastal communities.
I would like to address two of the questions that I think may be relevant to me. Now, one part is like, how can the questions, I think it's Laura who mentioned about how the scaling of the results that, what is the impacts that we have already scaling up, no? So we are, as I mentioned earlier, the rights issue, the recognition. Yeah, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, this is what. As I mentioned earlier, that in the absence of the recognition of the rights issues, we lose a lot of things, no? And that interconnectedness is not there, because when the rights is not recognized, the knowledge and practices are not there. And if not there, and then the climate change resilience is not there. So we are raising this awareness on the local government, also at the national level, and also all the other stakeholders, no? That how important the role and contribution of indigenous people, and to be protected, that one, the rights is the fundamental basis for recognition of land tenure security, recognition of customary governance and institutions. So that is what we are putting all our efforts, working with the indigenous people, leaders, youth, women, no, on the ground. And then another questions from Marina from Peru, that the role of the civil society organization for the funding mechanism to support the indigenous people. Definitely, all the stakeholder role is equally important, and civil society role is equally important, because the issues of indigenous people are very, very new, no? And then the organizational strength needs a lot of support from civil society, from all the donor agency, from bilateral, multilateral agency. We really, really need support, no? And especially with the indigenous people and local community issue, what we have been working on the ground in Nepal, like we support each other's issues, no? But we have a distinct issues and concerns we have own, but the common issues we work together. Distinct issue we hope to support each other. That's how we can work harmoniously for address our issues and concerns and recognition of our rights. Thank you.
I think my colleagues have responded to other questions. I just want to agree with Brother Kobe that the drought we're experiencing, for example, now is the worst in half a century for the last 50 years. So we have herds collapsing, livelihood disrupted, schools interrupted, and basically lives brought to a standstill, threatening the very existence of pastoral lives themselves, people. And there is very little support within nationally and externally. And I agree that because of climate change, this has become a more recurrent and more intensive scenarios that we are seeing, and therefore support would be most critical to secure the interests and the rights and the chance for life for these communities. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on what my co-panelists have mentioned, I would just like to focus on accountability, as mentioned by the lady over there. On accountability, I think starting on the process of FPIC, our indigenous peoples communities, local communities as well, know about this whole program or project being implemented. That's why in terms of when projects are being monitored and evaluated, they have already prepared, they have the knowledge on how this has been implemented, and they can articulate it very freely because they are engaged from the process of FPIC to the design to the implementation. So that's where accountability is. And then, of course, they have to comply with some of these reporting requirements, but basically, I think that is also where the CSOs can help as well in building the capacities of the indigenous peoples and local communities. I would also like to mention about on the scaling up of the results of these projects. Actually, we have developed systems of telling stories and then having this accessible through social media, as well as making video production on how these projects have impacted really on the livelihoods and on the sustainable management of resources by indigenous peoples and local communities. So these are some of the tools we have been developing, as well as in the development of reports. We really ensure that this is known and this is articulated to be listened to by the public. So that's how we build this accountability, as well as in informing the public about what we are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all the panelists, and I will not try to summarize this conversation that has been very rich. I will just borrow this sentence from Gustavo, who said there is a need to build alliances to really create a financing ecosystem where all these different funding mechanisms, all the partners who are really advocating for funding to go directly to indigenous peoples, local community, Afro-descendant peoples, and women to come together and share lessons and really work together to make sure that this becomes a reality. And I think we can do it, and this kind of conversation is just the beginning of that kind of partnership and building alliances. So this workshop is over, and I would like to thank also everybody who's contributed and participated in this conversation. Like I said at the beginning, there is another event just happening right now at 4:45, organized by the Rainforest Foundations and the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. And it's around the 1.7 billion pledge, so it's very complementary to this conversation. So I will really invite everyone to join us there, and it's at the Hat Shepherd Room. It's not far from here, and all of us actually we're going there, so please join us to that next conversation. And tomorrow there will be another panel organized by my colleague Omaira Bolaños on the global call to action for women. So there will be a women's alliance on the Global South who will be really coming together and making the call for direct access to funding for women. So I will invite you also to join that panel. You can check it on the schedule. And thank you again to all my colleague panelists. It has been a great and rich panel, and thank you everyone for joining us today.